Welcome to the Pint Glass Football Podcast.
Pint Glass Football. I'm your host, Brad Fowler. What's up, PGF Nation? Today, we have a fun episode for you guys. FanDuel recently put out their list of each NFL team's GOAT. We'll debate that list today, but joining me like always, my co-host, Alex Higdon. Alex, what is going on?
Let's get ready to rock the boat. A lot of things to say on this list.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. Some of these names are no-brainers. We'll put the full list in the show notes for you guys. There's some of these that are just kind of obvious answers that there's really no debate to be had. But there's several names on this list, Alex, when we went through it, that we had some debate with, or we thought there was at least some players that need to be mentioned here. Let's start here at the top. Arizona Cardinals, Larry Fitzgerald. I have no problem with this one.
Yeah, none at all. Not too much to talk about here.
Atlanta Falcons, they have Matt Ryan as the GOAT. Now, a former MVP, came up just short in a Super Bowl. Is there anybody else that you think deserves to be mentioned here, though?
Yeah, I'm going to mention Julio Jones. I think what he did, although in conjunction with Matt Ryan being there, this guy is 16th all-time in yards, and we know what type of dynamic player this was when he was healthy. But Julio Jones, I think, deserves an honorable mention here.
Baltimore Ravens, they have Ray Lewis as the greatest Raven of all time. This one seems like a slam dunk pick here. I think you can make a case for Ed Reed, though. Is there anybody else that you think deserves to be mentioned?
No, it's Ed Reed. But you know what? Actually, there is. I can't believe we've forgotten them, and they seem to be sometimes the forgotten men. Jonathan Ogden deserves a definite honorable mention here.
Wow, great call, Alex. You know what? Ogden is one of the all-time best. That's a great point. I would actually have no problem at all if they would have put him at the top of this list. Now, look, Ray Lewis, like I said, it's kind of the easy answer here. But the Ravens have had some great players, and I think Ogden is a great mention there. Now, Buffalo Bills, another team, has had a lot of success even without winning the Super Bowl, but they've had a lot of great players over the years. They have Bruce Smith as the greatest Buffalo Bill of all time. I don't have a problem with it, but I do think there's some guys that need to be mentioned here.
Off the top of my head right away is going to be O.J. Simpson. Now, when you talk about O.J. on the field, what he did in a 5-year span is damaging, and I probably don't think we've seen anything like it in a very, very long time. When you go what he did between 72 and 76, winning the MVP and Offensive Player of the Year, and basically through that 5-year stretch, he was top 4 in MVP voting for every single year, as well as Offensive Player of the Year. I think that's unprecedented. He does deserve to be mentioned here.
An unbelievable player in his prime. I think Jim Kelly certainly deserves to be mentioned. Hall of Fame quarterback. Thurman Thomas, another all-time great running back for the Bills, I think deserves to be mentioned as well. But once again, I don't have a problem with Bruce Smith being at the top of this list. One of the best defensive players of all time. Let's move down to the Carolina Panthers here. They've got Cam Newton as the greatest Panther of all time. Now, this is a team, as we know, was an expansion team in the 90s, so not a super long history here. But Cam Newton, former MVP, took them to a Super Bowl. Any issue with Cam being at the top?
Not really, not too much. I mean, Steve Smith Sr. deserves an honorable mention. How, I call him the Allen Iverson of this league, the same way I call Cam Newton the LeBron James of this league. Two things that we've really never seen in this league at a high level. We know Steve Smith Sr. is top 10 all time in in receiving, and Cam Newton just being the monstrosity that he was and basically changing the game and having rules change on his behalf is just remarkable. So I have no problem with Cam Newton here.
Yeah, I don't either. He had an unbelievable NFL career. He's a guy that, on a side note here, I have as the greatest college football player of all time. And we'll have to save that for another episode down the road here when we talk about some all-time great college players, maybe later this summer. But Cam Newton, unbelievable player, no issue at all for me having him as the best Panther of all time. Now, this next team is interesting because it's another team that has one of the longest lists of Hall of Famers of any team in the NFL. That's the Chicago Bears, and they have Walter Payton as the greatest Bear of all time. It seems like a home run. I don't have any real pushback on there, but I do think there's some players that need to be mentioned. One that jumps to the front of my mind here is Dick Butkus.
Yeah, Dick Butkus. We know there's a long line of middle linebackers here because we can jump from Dick Butkus and we can go right to Mike Singletary as well. But I think Walter Payton, what he did, that historic '85 Bears team. I mean, we can probably talk Richard Dent. We can probably talk a few people off of that '85 defensive team alone. But I think Walter Payton here is he works. I mean, just based off Tecmo Bowl alone, it should be Walter Payton. Sorry.
Yeah. No, he's an all-timer. Sweetness. I mean, just an unbelievable running back. He's one of those guys that I think has to be in the conversation of one of the greatest running backs of all time. I do want to give an honorable mention to Brian Urlacher, a defensive player of the year and an all-time great linebacker as well for the Bears. Cincinnati Bengals, they have Anthony Munoz as their greatest Bengal of all time. For me, this is a home run. I don't even have any pushback at all.
Very rarely is it going to be the left tackle, even though that team has got a few people that you may mention, but it's definitely Anthony Munoz unless somebody is out there still doing the icky shuffle.
Yeah. Oh, man. Cleveland Browns. This is another no-brainer here. For me, I don't even think this one's debatable. It's Jim Brown, another guy, like I mentioned with Walter Payton, that you could put in the conversation as maybe the greatest running back of all time.
We know what he did during that 10-year run with the Browns, and then just simply deciding to quit, a la Barry Sanders as well, in his prime to go do movies and other things. But I think it's Jim Brown who's up there. I think probably, if not number one, but definitely top three for greatest player of all time in the history of the league.
Yeah, absolutely. Not any debate there. Now, this one is interesting. The Dallas Cowboys, America's team, as we know, they have a rich history, a ton of great players spanning several decades of success for this team. They have Emmitt Smith as the greatest Cowboy of all time. Look, I don't have an issue with Emmitt being there, but I do think there are a number of players that certainly could have been chosen here.
Where do you want to start? You want to go to Michael Irvin? Because, we can honestly say, I know what Emmitt did. I know what it looked like. I know the broken arm against the Giants. I know all of that. But Michael Irvin was a monster on this team as well. And you can also talk about maybe even Tony Dorsett doesn't have the yards, but he was exciting to watch and the things that he did in that Cowboys uniform. I don't know, Brad, do you have any others?
Yeah, I think the greatest Cowboy of all time for me would be Larry Allen. Guard that for that great 90s team that played with Emmitt and Irving and some of these guys that you mentioned. I think a lot of people historically say Larry Allen might just be the greatest guard to ever play the game. Certainly one of the greatest offensive linemen to ever play the game. A dominant player in his day. I would have zero issue if his name would have been listed here. And actually, Alex, another guy that I think deserves an honorable mention here, Roger Staubach, 1970s Cowboys quarterback. For your old school Cowboys fans listening, they know how special of a player he was. Multiple Super Bowl winner, played in a couple other Super Bowls, came up just short in a couple Super Bowls against the Steelers in the 70s, but don't have an issue with Emmitt, but I don't think it's a home run case here. Moving down to the Denver Broncos, they have John Elway as the greatest Bronco of all time. I think we just move on.
Yep. Nothing to talk about here.
Yeah, one of the best to ever do it. Another team with a no-brainer at the top of their list, the Detroit Lions with Barry Sanders. Look, maybe you can mention Calvin Johnson. We know Matt Stafford was a great quarterback for them, but for me, this one is obvious. It's Barry, and there's really no debate.
96 Madden, I earned so much money in college beating people with the Lions because no one could stop me with Barry Sanders. It's Barry Sanders, hands down.
Yeah, absolutely. He was not even fair. Green Bay Packers. This one is interesting, Alex, because once again, we run into one of these historic teams that have had a ton of success and a ton of great players spanning multiple decades. They have Aaron Rodgers as the greatest Packer of all time. And look, Aaron Rodgers is the first ballot Hall of Famer when he hangs it up. I don't think there's any doubt about it. 4-time MVP, Super Bowl champion. But I'm not even sure he's the greatest quarterback to ever play for this team.
Right. I think we spoke about it off air before we came on. I mean, he actually might be number 3 on this list, and depending on how you feel about Bart Starr, it's definitely Bart Starr and Brett Favre probably ahead of him when you're starting to get into Packers history and what each one of those guys means to the team and what their worth is. He probably might be the 3rd best.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of recency bias here because Brett Favre, we sometimes forget how great he was in his prime. 3 straight MVPs in the 90s, went to back-to-back Super Bowls, won one, lost one. That streak in the 90s, Brett Favre was as good a player as there was in the NFL. Bart Starr, 5-time NFL champ, 2-time Super Bowl champ, a former league MVP, and he led the league in passing 5 different times. I have some pushback here with Rodgers. I mean, look, great player, but I'm putting both those guys ahead of him.
And you know what? If Sterling Sharp doesn't get hurt, Aaron Rodgers might get pushed down to 4th, but that's a story for another day.
Moving down to the Houston Texans, obvious answer here, J.J. Watt. I don't think this really needs much discussion with all the Defensive Player of the Year trophies and all the great things he did in his prime with the Texans is the easy answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Short career, well, not short career, but short time they've been in the league here, and they didn't take over any Houston Oilers history. So, yeah, it's J.J. Watt without a doubt. But good luck to you, C.J. Stroud, catching up.
Yeah. Well, he's off to a great start. That's for absolutely sure. I think they have a franchise guy in him. Now, speaking of franchise quarterbacks, the Indianapolis Colts, they have Peyton Manning at the top of their greatest of all time list. I don't have an issue with it. We know Peyton. I would put him near the top of the all-time greatest quarterback list. But I think there's a guy that needs to be mentioned here, Alex, and it's Johnny Unitas. 3-time NFL champ, a Super Bowl champ, 8-time All-Pro. This guy had passing records that lasted for decades. He was so far ahead of his time for when he played. A truly legendary quarterback in his own right.
Yeah, the guy that wore the high tops. We'll just leave it at that. If you know, you know. I mean, there's not much really to say with the exception of Peyton Manning. He really would be, without a doubt, number 1 for the Colts easily.
Jacksonville Jaguars, Fred Taylor, they have as their all-time greatest Jaguar. Look, Fred Taylor was a great player, but I have an issue with this one, Alex. For me, it's got to be Tony Boselli, 3-time first-team All-Pro, 5-time Pro Bowler, a Hall of Famer. He was part of the 90s All-Decade team, one of the great offensive linemen in league history. Fred Taylor was a great running back and a teammate of Tony Boselli's, but I don't think it's a lock he gets in the Hall of Fame here. So for me, I think Boselli would have been the better choice.
Yeah, you have Boselli, but I also want to mention Jimmy Smith. He's often forgotten because this team was another expansion team. They don't have a long history, but Jimmy Smith also deserves an honorable mention here. He's top 20 in receiving. I just think he's a person that also gets forgotten at times, given their short history.
Kansas City Chiefs, greatest of all time. They've got Patrick Mahomes as the greatest Chief of all time. Now, we've mentioned some recency bias with a couple other players on this list so far. This one I don't think is, though. In the short career that this guy has had, only at 28 years old, he's already put together a first ballot Hall of Fame career. There's been some great players for this team, Tony Gonzalez and several others. If you want to go back to Lynn Dawson and several others that I haven't even mentioned here. But I think Mahomes already deserves that honor.
And that's high praise because, as you mentioned, Tony Gonzalez is basically in the top 10 or maybe top 8 of every statistical, or at least the 3 bigs in catches, receiving yards, and touchdowns for a receiver as a tight end. And this is pre the way we use tight ends right now. So think back then when they were more inline. So he was doing a lot of damage on the inside and played and was healthy a lot of those years. But that's high praise for Patrick Mahomes to go over the Hall of Fame of Tony Gonzalez so early in his career.
All right, let's move to your Las Vegas Raiders, Alex. They have Marcus Allen listed as the greatest Raider of all time. This is another team with a rich history and a lot of great players over the years. Do you have an issue with Marcus Allen being at the top of this list?
Yeah, I have a problem with Marcus Allen. Okay, so to be fair, and I know a lot of it for most people who didn't get to see Marcus Allen live, there's mainly one highlight that goes around, and it's in the Super Bowl against the Redskins, a play I used a lot in the Tecmo Bowl. Thank you very much, and Bo Jackson. But, when you look at Marcus Allen statistically, There's only 3 years where he's the dominant guy, and maybe 1 year where he was probably the best running back in the league when he won a MVP and Offensive Player of the Year, and that was in his first 4 years. Other than that, he's basically been under 800 yards for the rest of his career. So when you start to look at it in total, it doesn't look like he should be the GOAT, especially when you have a guy like Tim Brown on that play for the Raiders, and as well, and let's mention another, that offensive line. We always have to talk about the offensive line. RIP to Gene Upshaw as a guard, a guy that came around the corner. He came around the corner with bad intentions.
Absolutely, Alex. Lester Hayes is another guy that I think deserves to be mentioned here. 39 career interceptions. He was a key part of 2 Super Bowl championship teams for the Raiders. You mentioned Tim Brown, of course. I mean, one of the most productive receivers in NFL history. I think Art Shell deserves mentioning here. Another Hall of Famer and a part of 2 Super Bowl championship teams. I think Marcus Allen, like you said, man, he had a window in his prime that was really special, but I don't know if he had the Raider career of some of these other guys. LA Chargers, obviously formerly the San Diego Chargers here, they have LaDainian Tomlinson as their greatest Charger of all time. I don't have an issue with this pick. We know he's a Hall of Famer, a former league MVP, had an unbelievable career, one of the great running backs to ever play in the league. But I think there are some other players here that could have been mentioned.
Well, the one guy I'm going to go to first out the gate is Antonio Gates, pun intended. He's an oft-forgotten tight end. When they start talking as the tight end position has moved forward, people always mention Tony Gonzalez, they mention Shannon Sharp, but Antonio Gates is an oft-forgotten guy in that era of tight ends that transition to the tight ends that we currently have. He needs to be mentioned here.
Antonio Gates, absolutely. This is a guy went undrafted out of Kent State as a basketball player. He was a power forward, an unbelievable athlete. Big hats off to the Chargers at that time, seeing the talent that this guy had and converting him into what would turn into a Hall of Fame level career. 4-time first-team All-Pro, 2-time second-team All-Pro. He was part of the 2000s All-Decade team. This guy's a legendary player, and I think you're absolutely right. He deserves mentioning here as possibly the greatest Charger of all time. A couple other players that came to mind, though. Lance Allworth, Hall of Famer, led the AFL in receiving yards 7 times. How about Junior Seau? Arguably one of the greatest linebackers of all time, 12-time Pro Bowler, 6-time All-Pro. Kellen Winslow, another historically great tight end for this franchise, 5-time Pro Bowler, 3-time All-Pro. And Dan Fouts, another Hall of Fame quarterback, led the NFL in passing 4 different times. Look, I have no problem with LT being at the top here, but this one becomes really debatable, Alex. How about the LA Rams? They have Aaron Donald as the greatest Ram of all time. Now, look, I don't have a problem with it. You can make a strong case as one of the greatest defensive players, regardless of position in the history of this league. But I think there's a couple guys that you can make a case for.
Aaron Donald, great choice. I understand a lot. Maybe there's a little bit of, actually, I could say there's a lot of recency bias here because I think without a doubt it's Deacon Jones and there shouldn't be any questions about it. And let's remember sacks, and since that's the biggest stat that most people try and go to for a defensive lineman, that was not even recorded until 1982, which is after Deacon Jones had finished playing. And with the Rams alone, he racked up basically 160 sacks on his own. So I think he should be the guy here as the greatest Ram of all time.
Yeah, Deacon Jones was unbelievable. Go watch some YouTube highlights if you guys want to see an unbelievable combination of speed and power. A really incredible player. I have no problem with that at all. But another guy that I think deserves mentioning here, how about Marshall Faulk? Former running back, of course, and a 3-time Offensive Player of the Year, a former league MVP, a Super Bowl champion. He was an unbelievable player and one of the great dual threat running backs this league has ever seen. Did you know that Pint Glass Football is more than just this podcast? We have an exclusive newsletter. Sign up for free at pintglassfootball.com to receive articles and insights delivered straight to your inbox. But wait, there's more. We're excited to announce our brand new YouTube channel. Not only can you listen to our podcast on YouTube, but you'll also find exclusive video content waiting for you. So hit the pause button right now and go subscribe to our newsletter and hit that subscribe button on YouTube to stay connected with the latest football news and our exclusive content. Underdog Fantasy is the easiest place to play fantasy sports. We personally love the pick'em game. Just pick between 2 and 5 players to build a pick'em entry. Pick whether your favorite players will have a higher or lower stat total in this week's game for a chance to win big. You can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Download the Underdog Fantasy app and sign up today with promo code PGF. That's promo code PGF to claim your special pick plus first-time deposit offer up to $250 in bonus cash. The official ticketing app of Pint Glass Football is now SeatGeek. I can't recommend them enough, guys. I've been using SeatGeek for years. You want to go to a game this season? SeatGeek is here to take the confusion out of buying tickets, making sure you get the best seats at the best prices. With SeatGeek, you'll never have to worry about overpaying for tickets again. How? They put a 0 to 10 score on each ticket, so you know you're getting a good deal. But here's the real game changer. You can get $20 off your first ticket purchase with the code PGFPOD. That's right, $20 off with code PGFPOD. This season, make every game day epic with SeatGeek. Download the SeatGeek app and remember to enter the code PGFPOD to grab your $20 discount. Miami Dolphins, they have Dan Marino as the greatest Dolphin of all time. I think we just move on.
Yeah, nothing to see here. I know there's a lot. I know there's the vaunted undefeated season that they had, but it's Dan Marino.
Absolutely. Minnesota Vikings, they have Randy Moss as the greatest Viking of all time. Look, Moss is a legend. We know that. But I think there's a couple guys that deserve to be mentioned here, Alex.
Yeah, well, first off my list is going to be Adrian Peterson. I think a guy that came into the league where everybody said during his freshman year in college that he should have sat out and he was ready to go pro, that came in and then delivered, and coming off a knee injury, ran for those 2,000 yards and should have broken the record. Shame on those coaches for not realizing that. I think that he has done enough damage in his career on the Vikings to worthy to be deemed the GOAT of the Vikings.
Yeah, Adrian Peterson, all-time great running back, a former league MVP in an era where it was pretty much unheard of for a running back to win that award. How about John Randall, though? Another guy that I think deserves to be mentioned here, one of the greatest defensive tackles to ever play this game. Alan Page deserves mentioning. Fran Tarkenton, quarterback from those 70s teams that competed for Super Bowls. I don't have any problem with Randy Moss being on this list, but I do think that it's not a no-brainer when you have this many great players that played for this franchise. New England Patriots, they have Tom Brady. Let's just move along.
Absolutely.
New Orleans Saints, Drew Brees, they have listed as the greatest Saint of all time. I don't think this is even debatable either.
Nope, we can nothing to see here.
New York Giants, now this is a team that's had a lot of great players, a rich history of Super Bowl success. Lawrence Taylor, they have listed as the greatest Giant of all time. I think you can make a case for him being arguably the greatest defensive player of all time. He's certainly in the discussion. Any issue with LT at the top of the Giants list?
The guy that revolutionized the outside linebacker position, I don't have a problem with him being the GOAT for this team.
The other New York team, the Jets, they have Darrelle Revis as the greatest Jet of all time. Interesting choice. It wouldn't have been the first name I necessarily would have thought of here. I think a lot of old school fans would think Joe Namath, maybe Curtis Martin. Do you have any issue with Revis Island being the greatest Jet ever?
Yeah, I have to go with Curtis Martin. I mean, what he did. I mean, this guy is literally the most quiet guy in the NFL and amassed all of the things that he amassed while basically saying nothing, just showing up to work every single day. I mean, think about this. If you look at the list for guys who are at the top of that for rushing yards, and when you see Curtis Martin, Emmitt Smith is loud. Walter Payton was Walter Payton. We could talk about Franco another day. I won't get into it now. Barry Sanders is a highlight reel. Adrian Peterson. Then you get LT and Jerome Bettis. And in the middle of that is Curtis Martin. He's the quietest person sitting there at number 6. It's the funniest thing to me when you look at that top 10 list.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. And look, nothing against Darrelle Revis. We know he was a lockdown corner and a great player, but I think it's got to be Curtis Martin too. And look, I know Namath was the quarterback for their lone Super Bowl championship, but I think Curtis Martin deserves to be the greatest Jet of all time. I think I'm with you here, Alex.
And Brad, you mentioned Joe Namath. They're talking about Darrelle Revis. Did you see Darrelle Revis doing a legs commercial or sitting on the sideline with a mink? Or did you see him holding up and guaranteeing any wins in the Super Bowl? I didn't, but Joe Namath did. And he not only changed the marketing of the NFL, he also made guarantees and then delivered to the Jets. So I think he 1,000% among most Jet fans, he's number one.
Yeah, absolutely, especially considering they were huge underdogs in that Super Bowl. For him to have the bravado to say, look, we're going to win this game and then deliver is one of the legendary moments in NFL history. Absolutely, Alex. Philadelphia Eagles, their GOAT is Reggie White. I don't think there's really much debate here. Even though the Eagles have had a lot of great players here, Reggie White was on another level.
Absolutely. Let the church say amen.
Pittsburgh Steelers, this one gets interesting because this is another one of those historic teams with a ton of success and a ton of Hall of Fame players. They have Mean Joe Green listed as the greatest Steeler of all time. Any issue here?
Mel Blount needs to be mentioned. And a person that I think if we revisit this in maybe, let's say 5 to 10 years, I think we could be TJ Watt can enter this conversation and have a legit claim to this title.
Wow, absolutely. Man, talk about an unbelievable player who's playing in his prime right now. But I believe last year he just reached the all-time franchise sack mark for this franchise, which is pretty impressive when you think about James Harrison and all these great players that have played on the defense especially. I like that you mentioned Mel Blount. I think he deserves mentioning. Troy Polamalu was a first ballot Hall of Famer that I think certainly could be mentioned here. DeMonte Dawson, one of the greatest centers of all time. Jack Lambert, an all-time great linebacker and a key part of those 4 Super Bowl championships from the 70s. Rod Woodson, I think sometimes gets forgotten. I don't know if he deserves to be a GOAT, but certainly a great player. The list kind of just goes on and on for this team. I don't have a problem with Joe Green, though. He was really the catalyst for this franchise turning it around and becoming the team that we know them as today. Another historic franchise that's had a lot of great players here, Alex, but I think it really comes down to 2 names alone. The San Francisco 49ers. They have Jerry Rice listed as their GOAT. Many will say the greatest wide receiver of all time. Is he the greatest 49er of all time?
Well, I mean, you just saying the greatest wide receiver of all time. And prior to Tom Brady, they had another guy named Joe Montana who was basically considered the greatest quarterback of all time. So I think you have the battles of the greatest of their respective positions on the same team at the same time, each one assisting the other to the heights of the GOAT at their respective positions on the same team. I think he has a battle here, but because of the longevity with the 49ers, Jerry Rice may take the cake.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, this next team, Alex, is where I have the biggest issue with every single name on this GOAT list. For me, I highlighted this team because I think they absolutely missed the mark big time with this selection. I think there's several players that deserve to be ahead of the Seattle Seahawks GOAT, according to FanDuel, being Russell Wilson.
Yeah, I don't think Russell. I know Russell has done a lot since he came in as a rookie and nobody was expecting him to start, and what he amassed while he was there and what he did for the area, going to 2 Super Bowls, winning one, should have won another. Sorry, Seahawk fans. I know I just got to grind your gears a little bit there. But we have to mention Steve Largent. When this man retired, he was the best wide receiver of all time because he held all the records at that point in time when he retired. And because Russell, with everything that he's done, I know we weight Super Bowls a lot heavier, especially when it comes to quarterbacks. But I think what Steve Largent did there is deserving of him being deemed the GOAT of the Seahawks.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of recency bias. I also think Russell Wilson being the quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks lone Super Bowl championship, I think that is pushing him towards the top of this list. But there's just way too many players historically for this team that I think should be ahead of him. You mentioned Steve Largent. Absolutely agree. How about Kenny Easley? Unbelievable safety, NFL Defensive Player of the Year, Hall of Famer, first team All-Pro 3 consecutive years, led the NFL in interceptions one season. Cortez Kennedy made the Pro Bowl in 8 out of 9 seasons, was named first team All-Pro 3 consecutive years in his prime. And Walter Jones, the offensive tackle for the Seahawks, 9 Pro Bowls in 10 years, 4 first team All-Pro, 2-time second team All-Pro, named to the NFL 2000s All-Decade team. And get this stat. He only allowed 23 quarterback sacks on 5,500 passing attempts. You want to talk about a dominant player that Walter Jones was. I think any one of these names deserve to be ahead of Russell Wilson.
And I want to give an honorable mention to Sean Alexander as well. That 5 to 6 year run that he had, also leading them to a Super Bowl and being the MVP. And we know how hard it is for a running back to gain MVP and Offensive Player of the Year. With that incredible year he had in 2005, I think warrants him being mentioned as well. I mean, that he was something special for a 5-year period.
Tampa Bay Buccaneers, not a rich history, even though they've got the 2 Super Bowls, but they did have some great players. They have Derek Brooks as the greatest Tampa Bay Buck of all time. Any pushback here?
Well, I think without a doubt, the first person that's going to come to mind is Warren Sapp. I mean, a smaller interior. I believe Warren Sapp was only like 6'1", 6'2". He's not the quintessential pass rusher on the interior that you want, similar to, you mentioned John Randall earlier, but I think he is deserving of being mentioned. But a person that I actually want to mention, and it's interesting when you hear it, Tom Brady. Now, Tom Brady did only play there 3 years, but within those 3 years, he bought them a championship. He brought them to the brink of going to another championship, and he's third all time in passing for them. Jameis Winston is number 1. So to your point, Brad, this is not a rich history, and he's second in touchdowns for them. So I think Tom Brady's an interesting look here.
Yeah, pretty incredible. For only being there 3 years, what he accomplished is unreal, but that's why you're the GOAT of all the GOATs. Unbelievable stretch he had there. Tennessee Titans, greatest of all time, Warren Moon. Now, this is interesting because, as we know, he played for the Houston Oilers, but their franchise, of course, moved to Tennessee, so they carry that history. I love this choice because I think Warren Moon is somewhat of a forgotten great quarterback of all time. I think he's one of the more underrated players historically to ever play in the NFL. Any issue with him being the greatest Titan of all time?
Well, I don't, and I think Warren Moon is one of our forgotten quarterbacks. I don't even want to say heroes, but our forgotten quarterbacks because he spent a lot of time up there in Canada. But I think it's worth mentioning Derrick Henry. The tear that he's been on since he's been entered in as the starter is unprecedented. And still, even after injury, he's still continuing on being a top 2, top 3 running back in the league. And now with Baltimore, he's looking to even further his career. So he's something to look out for in the future. And I don't think we can go anywhere past without mentioning the battering ram that Earl Campbell was for this team as the Houston Oilers.
Let's wrap up this list here with the Washington Commanders, another team, even though they haven't had a lot of success in these past couple decades, a 3-time Super Bowl championship franchise who's had a lot of great players. They have Darrell Green, the former defensive back here, as their greatest commander of all time. Any issue with him, Alex, being the GOAT for this franchise?
No, consummate professional guy. Even when he left the league at 43, he was still the fastest man in the league. And you know what? kudos to the Commanders because, during the entire Snyder reign as owner of the Commanders / Redskins, he did not go back. He was not welcomed back to their facilities or welcomed back into the fold of the team. He stayed away from the team that entire time. And with new ownership coming in, they've welcomed him back. Great content they have on YouTube if you haven't seen it, in terms of he's not even in the Ring of Honor. So never mind the Hall of Fame. He's in the Hall of Fame, but he's not even in the Ring of Honor for the Commanders, which is odd. But they will be doing that this year. So kudos to the new ownership and bringing back Darryl Green into the fold.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point, Alex. And I have no issue with him being at the top of this list. I think there are two players that maybe deserve some mentioning here. That'd be John Riggins, of course, the former great running back, and Art Monk, one of the great wide receivers for this franchise. I think deserve to be at least mentioned in the conversation, but I have no problem with Darryl Green being the guy at the top of this list. If you enjoy the podcast, do us a favor and subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. But once again, I'm Brad Fowler. He's Alex Igdon. This is Pint Glass Football, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Pint Glass Football Podcast. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at PGF Podcast.
Zencastr is the ultimate web-based podcasting solution. It provides high-quality audio and video podcast production and hosting. With a full suite of professional tools, podcasters can seamlessly record, produce, and publish studio-quality content all from one dashboard. Zencastr's post-production process takes the headache out of audio production. Set the right podcast loudness and levels while reducing background noise with a click of a button. Coordinating all your guests to record in person is painful and tedious. Easily invite up to 11 participants per recording with one click. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code PGFP, and you'll get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr Professional. I want you to have the same easy experiences I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story.